Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Cynthia Bernardez. I am a program manager here with the Science and Technology Policy Fellowships here at AAAS, and I will be your moderator for today's chat. So the live chats are an opportunity to learn more about the fellowships. It gives you an opportunity to explore the different placements and opportunities at STPF, to find out how the fellowships can transform your career. And it's also the opportunity for you to ask fellows and alumni any questions that you may have. So listed on this slide are our previous chats from this series. So please visit our live chats page on our fellowships website in order to review these past discussions. Today is Ask a Fellow Anything. So therefore, please submit your questions in the question box. And remember, you are driving the conversation today, so please submit your question. So as a reminder of our eligibility criteria, you must be a U.S. citizen and have a doctoral degree in science and engineering. Applicants can also have a master's, however, a master's in engineering and 3 years professional experience post receiving the engineering degree. For the judicial fellowship applying for that branch, applicants must have 3 years professional experience post receiving their PhD. The application deadline for the fellowships is November 1 at 11:59 p.m. So please submit your applications then. And for the 2019 fellowship year, it begins September 1, 2019 and concludes August 31st, 2020. So this is a full-time commitment and all hosts or all placements are in the Washington, D.C. area. Please remember to visit the fellowship's websites for complete details about program areas, eligibility, and the application process. So now, let's introduce you to fellows that are joining us today. However, as I introduce the panelists, I would like to get to know the audience and where you are in the application stage. So please take the time to answer the poll question on your screen. Okay. So today we have Julia Bradley Cook. She was a 2016-18 Executive Branch Fellow at USAID, or U.S. Agency for International Development, and she was the climate advisor. She was the climate advisor in USAID's Africa's Bureau, where she provided technical support and program management for international development programs focused on climate smart agriculture, landscape scale carbon management, climate information services, and low emissions development. Julia was also a 2015-16 Congressional Science and Engineering Fellow, sponsored by many societies, but 3 societies, the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, and Soil Science Society of America. And she worked in the office of Senator Ron Wyden. She holds a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from Dartmouth College. Next, we have Emeril Mujin. She is a current Executive Branch Fellow at the National Institutes of Health in the National Institute on Aging, Division of Behavioral and Social Research, working on topics including health disparities, formal and informal caregiving, and Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. Emeril was also a 2016-17 Congressional Science and Engineering Fellow, sponsored by the American Sociological Association, working in the offices of Representative Mike Honda and Senator Kristen Gillibrand. She holds a PhD in sociology from University of California, Davis. So thank you, ladies, for joining us today. As a reminder all, to ask fellows questions, please type your questions in the comment section. Well, we have a slide that kind of shows you the comment section. But remember, keep your questions short and directed to any particular individual or to both panelists. We will try to get to as many questions as we can. So please send over your questions. And again, you are the driver for today's conversation. So please, again, submit your questions. So let's turn it over to our panelists for today. So beginning with the open question, in your pre-fellowship career stage, why did you decide to apply to the fellowship? So I'll go in order of Julia and then followed by Emeril.
Sure, thank you so much, Cynthia. So I went into graduate school interested in trying to make climate and environmental science available for decision makers. That was part of my motivation for getting a PhD, was being able to understand more about how to do that kind of research. And so science policy was always on my radar as a career option that I wanted to know more about and pursue possibly in the future. I ended up in my research focusing on climate impacts in the Arctic region, but at the same time spent a lot of time learning and developing my skills around science communication. And because I realized that you need to be able to talk to people who are non-specialists about really complicated things like climate change. And doing that is not about reciting paper abstracts to people. So in the pursuit of developing those skills, I learned the #1 rule of science communication, which is know your audience. So in addition to being curious about the career opportunities, realized that in order to make science as accessible to decision makers and to understand more the role of science within decision making, I needed to throw myself into the mix of it. And for me, the way to do that ended up being through the Science Policy Fellowship. I finished my PhD and handed it in, and then the next Monday started my Congressional fellowship on the Hill. And so to say that it was a big change of pace, I think is an underestimate. And it was really like going into this work environment where the pace of how decisions have to be made and what kind of decisions are even what kind of work and how you engage with other people is a totally different work environment. But I got to work on some fascinating issues that were related to my scientific background. And then also a whole host of issues that I never thought I would get to know the inside wonkiness of what legislation around that are really priorities for the senator whose office I was working in. So all of those changes for me were really exciting and something I was really looking for at the time, and continue to be excited about as I think about my career going forward. But I really, coming out of that, wanted to I saw the Executive Branch Fellowship as an opportunity to get to provide my science training in a more focused and sustained manner. And so I ended up working, applying and then getting the fellowship at the U.S. Agency for International Development. And I've been working on bringing climate science into the programming and decisions around development that the U.S. government does in Africa. And so for me, yeah.
Julia, I'm sorry to cut you off. I definitely want to hear more about your Executive Branch Fellowship, but I wanted to turn the table over to Emeril for pre-fellowship in terms of why she applied. And then I definitely want to continue our conversation in terms of life as a fellow.
Sure.
You know, how was your, what was your experience? What were some items that you worked on? So Emeril, pre-fellowship, why did you apply to, where were you and why did you decide to apply to the fellowship?
Sure. Thanks, Cynthia. Hi, everyone who's on the chat. So I had some exposure to, I guess, the executive branch and life and working in DC prior to going to graduate school. I had a short stint at the Department of Justice soon after undergraduate, and that's what first exposed me to the idea of policy making, policy implementation process here in DC. So going into graduate school, it was something that was always a part of my interest as I was going through my graduate education. So it was a balance between thinking about pursuing the tenure track and becoming a professor, along with an interest in returning to working in the government or working in Congress. And so when it came time to start filing my dissertation and thinking about next steps, the American Sociological Association, which is the sponsoring society for my congressional fellowship, has a program that allows for fellows to be sponsored by ASA and supported by AAAS to work in Congress for a year. And so I applied through that program. AAAS also does have their own 2 positions open for congressional fellows, but of the pool, I would say, I believe about 30 or so, 30 to 35 fellows. The majority of them are sponsored by various professional societies, such as my own and Julia's. And so it was a distinct, separate application process that then brought me to the congressional branch, where I worked initially for the congressman from Silicon Valley, Congressman Mike Honda. Unfortunately, he was voted out in the 2016 election, and at that time, I was able to then transition and get exposure both to the House as well as the Senate, where I worked for Senator Gillibrand for the remainder of my fellowship. With that 1-year experience, much like Julia, I'd received sort of a snapshot into what applying social science knowledge to the policy process was like, and now I wanted to see, given the work we are doing of thinking about legislation, writing oversight letters to federal agencies, I wanted to see what the implementation side looked like. And so at that point, I applied to the AAAS Executive Branch Fellowship and was fortunate enough to be placed at the National Institutes of Health. And I would like to say, especially to all the social scientists who are on the chat, I was very pleasantly surprised to see all the various opportunities that are open to social scientists throughout the various agencies. So at USAID, where Julia is placed, there are several different divisions and offices that were very interested in bringing on individual researchers with strong social science backgrounds to do both quantitative and qualitative research. The Census Bureau is also very interested in bringing on social scientists, and of course the National Institutes of Health, which I think is oftentimes thought of as primarily a biomedical institution. But there are several different areas where sociologists such as myself are doing work on population health and health disparities. So I just want to encourage everyone out there who's applying to know that there are several spaces. It's not the STEM-dominated type of experience that some people might assume. AAAS does a wonderful job of supporting fellows and placing fellows across various science disciplines.
Thank you, Emeril. So we're going to go into the poll responses just to see where everyone is and within their application status. So we have 65% working on applications, which is great. We have 29% who may apply. Oh, wait, we've updated. Sorry, excuse me. So we have you started the application? 61% of you all have started an application, 11% not yet, 28% no, but will apply in the future, which thank you so much for participating in our live chat today. And nope, just curious. Oh, we don't have any curious individuals, which is great as well, just to show us that you are really considering the fellowship. So thank you so much again for completing the poll and allowing us to see where everyone is. So our first question for today is, okay, I'll read it out loud. Have y'all or other fellows faced a lack of support from faculty advisors that aren't supportive of non-academic career pathways? Any tips or strategies for managing such challenges? So I see both of you all. So I'll turn it back to Julia to respond.
Yeah, I would say that this is something that I have heard of as being people's experiences, and it can be a very real factor on the opportunities, especially in graduate school, that you are able to pursue. What I would recommend in these cases is I'm a huge believer in not a single mentorship model, but a mentorship network. And so to the best of your degree that you can pursue mentorship, informal mentors from people who are knowledgeable about science policy, have experience perhaps, or are supportive. Make sure that you're developing those relationships and pursuing those, driving encouragement and ideas, suggestions, feedback based on those relationships. That's my first suggestion in that case. Emeril, curious what else you would.
Sure, yes, that question did resonate with me, not because that was necessarily my experience, but I completely understand that feeling of concern and the potential stigmatization that comes from wanting to pursue something outside of what we think of as the ivory tower of academia and the non-tenure track. So with that said, my committee members, my dissertation committee members and mentors were incredibly supportive of me applying to the Congressional Fellowship with the American Sociological Association because it is our professional society. But more than that, they were supportive of the fact that I was doing work with my background in an applied manner. So I was very fortunate in that way. I recognize that not all graduate students are fortunate to have mentors who can be fully on board because there are diminishing resources, diminishing time. Faculty may want to invest in the students they know will go on to perpetuate the field. So that is a very real thing. I think one way to potentially navigate maintaining those mentorship relationships while trying to dabble in or see if the policy making process or this fellowship is for you is to try to see what opportunities might be available to you outside of researching, working in the lab, or being a teaching assistant. So what I did was UC Davis is one of 3 federally funded poverty centers. So there's a Center for Poverty Research at UC Davis that's funded by the Department of Health and Human Services. I was a graduate affiliate there. I got exposure to the process of writing policy briefs through the center, engaging with faculty and grad students from departments of public health, human development, School of Education, so interdisciplinary scholars who are interested in policy and poverty. So to the extent that your institution or university offers various avenues for you to flex your policy muscle or to just get some more applied experience, I understand as graduate students and as postdocs, there's already a lot of stretch on your time to continue doing the work you're already doing. But I think to the extent that you're able to explore on the side or in earnest additional opportunities that might allow you to get some exposure, I would hope that you would have the support of your faculty and mentors to do that work.
Thank you, ladies. So question 2. This writer writes that he or she has been speaking with lots of current and former fellows and have heard mixed opinions about how personal you should be in your statements. What do you think? So I'll let you guys decide who would want to answer that question first. Go ahead, Julia. Or
I was pointing at Emeril.
Okay.
I guess I am wondering clarification on the personal or the application statement, or
there's a personal statement within the application, or just a statement of interest. And so how personal can an applicant be? Should they go into writing about their family, or what is the boundary that you would recommend for this applicant?
Okay, I've got it. So I think I spoke a bit about the mentorship experiences I'd had in various immigrant communities because part of my research background is on immigrant integration. So I spoke about the sort of activities and community engagement I had outside of, my identity as a graduate student, but would describe how it related back to my interests with my overall research agenda, the kinds of knowledge and insights it provided to inform the work that I did, as well as how that might be useful for the work I would do in the Congressional Fellowship as well as the Executive Branch Fellowship. So I think to the extent that it can highlight the multiple dimensions of your identity, because we are all more than just our scientific identities, although that's a significant part of who we are. I think to the extent that you can clearly make the connection between those other parts of your life and how they would relate back to your interest in the fellowship or how you would apply your skills to the fellowship. I think that's important to make those connections for the review committee.
Julia?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with what Emeril just said. Another way to think about it, and it doesn't conflict at all, but my impression is that AAAS really wants to know from your application, what are your objectives as a fellow? What would you want to be getting out of the experience? What would you be bringing to the experience with you? And of course, tied up in all of that is the personal and direct experiences that you've had. So including anecdotes about that illustrate the motivation for applying and how you would build on that and continue to be a leader and support science and policy and decision making. How you've done it before is a great indicator of what is going to happen into the future, because none of us have crystal balls. So I think that it's actually can be a very powerful way to explain yourself to the committee who is reading a pile of such applications. But of course, it's a limited space, so you're going to have to rework that personal essay and make sure that every word counts. And so really at the end, it's more like, how do you boil it down to something that's just succinct and compelling?
Thank you, ladies. So our next question is, this person is currently in a heavily academic setting in their PhD program. What kinds of activities can this person or this applicant get involved with now that would help him or her stand out as an applicant?
That's a great question. I think that I actually made a list of things coming into this that I can rattle off, and then we can maybe add on to it after. But so getting involved in your student government, if all the student graduate student postdoc government council, being a representative on faculty meetings. So this is all like how academia organizes itself around decision making. So it's a process that has to be happening anyway. Insert yourself in there and support that, those processes and bodies, and then run with it, whatever is interesting to you. I would say if there's a look out for any groups around science policy, and if there isn't one, consider starting one. It can be as ambitious or tempered as you have the capacity for. Reach out to the government affairs liaisons in your institution and see if there's any way that you can get involved in the policy and outreach that they do. do public outreach. A lot of policy is around communication. So any chance to do science communication, engineering communication with non-scientific audiences is a great way to build skills. And yeah, just generally find ways to explore, cultivate, and follow your own interests, because if there's something that you feel passionate about, you're more likely to find the time in the day to do that.
Emeril, do you have anything to add?
Not much, but I would say, I think to what Julia was saying about cultivating and building on your existing experiences, it can be hard to find the time to go out and pursue new endeavors. So to the extent that you can amplify or exploit the existing activities or opportunities that you're already engaged in. For example, we know that at times research can be a very insular or independent type process, and working in the Congressional Fellowship, and especially working in the Executive Branch Fellowship, requires a lot of collaboration and teamwork. So for the purposes of your application, at least, thinking about how in your existing workflow or existing commitments do you exercise these types of opportunities for teamwork, communication of scientific concepts to both scientific and lay audiences. And so I believe oftentimes there are fellows who will volunteer to be the ones who evaluate science fair projects. So even things like that, that type of outreach can be important to highlight in your application, and to see how that type of engagement might foster your interest in doing work beyond just strictly research.
And I would also add, Cynthia, sorry, I forgot to mention, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, there are a lot of really interesting training experiences, so geared at scientists to get scientists outside of their comfort zone and into a policy environment. And one such training that I did as a graduate student is offered by the American Meteorological Society. They offer a summer policy colloquium, and that's 10 days, which is a big commitment, but there's also the AAAS Science Policy Conference that you can attend. There are online trainings and groups that you can get. The National Science Policy Group is a group that operates mainly virtually, and you can get involved with them. And so really, if you can commit to something like that and throw yourself into the policy environment, you're more likely to soak it up in a way that helps you internalize what your science policy interests are and hone in on those.
And a kind of similar question I have is a current university faculty member. And so the question is, how can this faculty member best sell themselves as prospective candidates for the fellowship? So it's similar to the question we've just answered. However, I guess for the faculty member, not necessarily a graduate student, do you have any sort of advice or guidance for this particular person? So, Emeril?
Sure. So I've gotten to know a lot of the fellows through the executive branch, and so I think the assumption that most fellows are primarily straight out of graduate programs or postdocs is not true. There's a really great range of fellows who are early, mid, and senior in their career, and many of them are faculty members who might be taking a sabbatical year or two to do the fellowship, or who might be thinking of making a career transition. I think one way to potentially highlight the unique experience and skills that you'll be bringing both to the fellowship and able to take back to your department afterwards is that you are at a certain point in your career where you have leverage to take what you've learned from the fellowship and then advocate for your own graduate students to see the multiple career options they might have available to them. it's a way for you to potentially craft future coursework that has an applied or policy perspective informing the courses that you're teaching. And then in terms of your own experience, I think if you are a faculty member researcher that is constantly applying for grants and at NSF or NIH, for example, the exposure that you'll get will be really instructive, not only for understanding how application reviews are conducted and what reviewers are looking for in successful grants and awards. It'll allow you to take that knowledge back to your own department to be successful as a grantee, but also to pass on that knowledge to your students. So I think it's definitely a two-way street. There are ways you can emphasize what you will contribute to the fellowship as well as what you will gain and how you will disseminate that knowledge and expertise after you complete the fellowship.
Thanks. Our next question, so we're gonna shift. I'm reviewing questions as they come in, and I am categorizing them within in different areas. And so right now, I guess we're going to stay in the application phase right now. So one of the questions is, what is the ideal profile of I think a reference letter or a rec letter writer? Wait, I'm reading it and I'm, okay, so what is the ideal profile of a rec letter writer? And should you prioritize how well they know you and how recently they've worked with you? And so, I'm gathering that it's a reference letter writer. So who should serve as your reference? And how do you prioritize as far as when they've, worked with you? So I guess Julia.
Yeah, I can take this one. I would say that the timing of when you worked with the person is less important than the skills that they can speak to. You set of references that you will ask for the AAAS fellowship experience or fellowship application is much different than a academic application. You want people who can speak to your leadership skills, who can speak to your interest in science policy if that's possible, and having people who can speak to your research experience, I don't think is a bad thing, but it won't give you the leading edge necessarily. And so not that it doesn't matter, but obviously it's important to be bringing in with you, but the way that you can stand out is by bringing in references with people who have worked with you in more of the that expand your reference beyond academia a little bit if possible. It doesn't have to be everyone. You can think about it as a reference package because it's tough to have a full list of references who might be able to speak to your science policy training and skills. But the timing of it recent sure would be ideal, but sometimes those people who can speak to those skills are not the ones who are embedded in your day-to-day research in your current position.
Emeril, do you have anything to add?
So if I remember correctly, my 3 letter writers were all members of my dissertation committee. So you may be in the position where the people who know you best are the ones you interact with, do research for in the everyday. I think if that is the case, you would probably want each of them to highlight different aspects of your work with them. So each of the committee members were dissertation members for me, but I also worked on very distinct research projects for each of them. And so it was then a matter of help me help you. So I would provide background material to help inform their letter writing, and I would highlight different things in each of the source materials I would give them to help them build out their letters in ways that would allow each of the letters to stand out differently.
Okay. I have a writer here or participant here who has a MD, but works in technology. And so specifically banking technology. And so how can this person use their MD experience into science policy? So have you encountered any fellows who have an MD or who has, a tech background or rather who has no science policy background and really wants to apply to the fellowship, but don't, have the gears to know anything about science policy? So how do you recommend either this MD or a person who does not have any science policy background use that in applying to the fellowship? Emeril? Julia? Or Julia? Julia, do you want to kick this one off?
Yeah, I think that it's having science policy experience per se is not required, or is under that label. But what I would encourage you to think about is the fact that you're probably doing something in the greater realm of science policy, even though you may not realize it. So working on banking technology with a biomedical background or MD background is that's advancing a perhaps basic research or applied research that could be relevant to society in ways that this person will obviously know better than me. But that is very much under the realm of science for pursuing science for policy. There's also, of course, policy for science. And so maybe what I would encourage this person to think about is where are the agencies, what are the parts of the government that fund kind of research that they're working on, and what makes those parts of the government work. And so that part of the government is funded by Congress, and what sets Congress's priorities around the particular funding stream that agency gets. And so even though they may, it might seem peripheral, it's part of this web that is science policy. And so what I would really encourage them to think about is finding a way to explore and articulate some of those connections, whether it's science funding or making their research useful for society, and voila, then you have something related to science policy that's very relevant. So but it's a system that you have to become familiar with, and I don't work in that field, so I can't explain it here right now, but it's being able to speak to that will help them understand the role that they could play if they want to continue in that field, and make the case for why they would be an asset for within the fellowship.
Emeril, do you have anything to add?
Sure. So I think, yeah, if you feel like you are lacking in a policy background right now, I think demonstrating a very sincere and strong interest in applying your areas of expertise, which I think are very unique, right? Medical background and technology in the financial banking sector. From my time on the Hill, oftentimes offices are looking for fellows who are interested in learning about the legislative process, but who could potentially provide expertise and advice to a broad range of portfolio areas. So in a way, if you're interested in the Congressional Fellowship, I think having these very unique knowledge areas combined might make you a very valuable asset. Thinking about the Executive Branch Fellowship, for example, at the National Institute on Aging in the division that I work, we're studying Alzheimer's disease and cognitive decline, and how do we detect that early on. And one of the ways might be through everyday activities like banking. So as individuals are experiencing cognitive decline, do they show, lapses in paying off their credit card bills? So that's just one example that your areas made me think of. But to the extent that you might have an awareness, or to do some research, as Julia mentioned, of priorities that are being pursued across the federal agencies where your expertise might be valuable, might be something that you could incorporate into your application to show that you have the bona fides and the interest to pursue that kind of work.
And I do, just to add to that, sorry, Cynthia, even though it can seem daunting, like how do I get into this world when I don't have experience? And I do think it's a really important thing to figure out for your individual path and to be a successful applicant, because in your application, you really need to have something to point to that shows that you're interested, you explored this, and you continue to be excited about it going forward. And the more specific that is, the more compelling your application. So it's worth it, and it doesn't have to be your whole career or your whole position that is dedicated to science policy. It can be something on the side that you have cultivated along the way.
Okay, well, let's talk about you two for a second. So you applied to the Congressional Fellowship prior to, of course, going into the executive branch. So when applying, so it's a lot of questions. One, what made you apply to the Congressional Fellowship versus executive branch first? That's one. Then second, what made you then want to continue on to the executive branch? So that's two. However, within both of those applications, how did you tailor your application for the Congressional Fellowship? And then how did you tailor your application for the executive branch fellowship? So those are three questions. So I will let Emeril take this one first to kick us off.
Okay, sure. So as I mentioned earlier, the Congressional Fellowship was sponsored through my professional society, the American Sociological Association. So for me, that was a natural avenue to pursue, because it was, I had exposure to it through my professional society and had encouragement from my mentors and just general support to move in that direction, and my interest in returning to DC now with PhD in hand. So for the purposes of applying to the Congressional Fellowship, I emphasized the research background I had, but also the research-aligned, policy-aligned skill sets that I had. So as I mentioned, the work I had done at the Center for Poverty Research, working with interdisciplinary type audiences. So I think for that application, I emphasized the scientific background as much as I did my skill set. When it came to then applying to the executive branch, my interest there was in having spoken to a handful of fellows who had made that transition, their interest in getting insights as they were trying to figure out their career paths of both the legislative branch as well as the executive branch. And that was something that definitely appealed to me. As sort of a preview, those types of questions will come up in one of the later stages of the executive branch application process. So as part of the in-person or Skype interview, I should say, you will be asked about the fact that you have had already some exposure and experience through the legislative branch fellowship, and what then drives your decision to pursue the other executive branch. And so I had to articulate how I was continuing to build on my skill set, and especially given that I had already had some previous experience working in the federal government pre-graduate degree, I had to articulate how, with my newly minted science background, how that meant it would be a very different career trajectory and experience for me to be coming back to the federal government.
Julia?
Yeah, so I think for me, my interest in applying to the Congressional Fellowship, it seemed like a really unique and exciting experience and a way to, just give me exposure to something totally different than the academic work environment that I had been in for what felt like a really long time at that time. But there is also this interesting detail for the application process that the Congressional Fellowship you can apply to while you're finishing your PhD, as long as you have your PhD in hand at the beginning of the fellowship. So if you are in your final year, these things are difficult to predict, you know that you're going to be finishing before August 31st, then you can apply to the Congressional Fellowship. On the other hand, the executive
This is through, I guess I want to make it clear, through your partner society.
Through the partner societies. Thank you. Yes. So the partner societies, as Cynthia mentioned at the beginning, I was sponsored by the American Agronomy, Crop and Soil Societies. And so the partner societies have a slightly different policy than AAAS. And so AAAS, Congressional Fellowship, and also the Executive Fellowship, you have to have your PhD in hand. And so I knew going into the fellowship application that this was more of a career change for me rather than experience to go back to academia with. And so later I was eligible for the executive fellowship. I wasn't actually eligible until after completing the Congressional Fellowship. So that was just a small logistical thing, but it was a fascinating experience. And I wouldn't characterize myself as being a political animal, like someone who wants to go to the Hill and be very politically active. I had volunteered in some political campaigns previously, but for me it was such a unique experience because you learn about a system that it almost feels like something that every American should do at some point in their life, because it teaches you so much about how things do or don't work in Congress. And so I'm really grateful for that experience. But then since doing the executive fellowship, I have found that the ability to dive deeper into technical areas that align with my background, for me personally, is more gratifying on a day-to-day basis. Whereas being on the congressional side, you're dealing with a lot of issues more at a superficial level, is the generalization.
Was there a difference in application for both congressional and executive? Just in terms of how you tailored and how you specifically wrote your statement in going into congressional or in going into executive? Were there some things that you highlighted in one versus the other?
I think one thing to keep in mind is, with the Congressional Fellowship, you will be working in a personal office, and by that I mean the office of a member of the House of Representatives or a senator, or you may work on a committee. And in that instance, one thing to keep in mind if you are interested, in my case, making the transition from congressional to executive, was that I had worked for both members who are Democrats. And in transitioning to the executive branch, one area that I emphasized was the issues I was interested in working on, the policy issues in particular. I emphasized that, and also that my experiences had allowed me to work in a very bipartisan manner on certain issues. Because the executive branch, we all serve at the pleasure of the president, and there should not be ideological leanings or influence in the work and the mission and the goals that we're trying to achieve in the agency. So that is something to keep in mind, a consideration to take into account in terms of tailoring or perhaps messaging in your applications.
And just to add to that, I would, you get it through the Congressional Fellowship. You do go through a matching process, so you can find an office that works for whatever your goals are going into it. But I found actually during the application process for the Congressional Fellowship that one of the questions during the interview was, if you are asked to write up statements in support of a policy that you don't individually agree on, how are you going to respond to that? And so, and it's a very real scenario because you're in the office supporting this member of Congress, and so there are some dilemmas that might arise if you aren't politically aligned with the individual, which is likely to happen at some point or another. And so you have to be able to articulate that you understand your role in the office, and yeah, it's a tricky question. But in terms of the application itself, I really emphasize science communication for my congressional application, because knowing that in talking about issues with the member or with constituents, you have to take really complicated concepts and boil them down and make them relevant to people in a way that are very tied to the skills for science communication. And so that was something that I really emphasized. And then and of course it's relevant on the executive branch, but I wasn't quite as much of an emphasis in that application.
So really quickly, because time is running from us. One question is, do you have any advice for an applicant whose primary policy interests are not scientific? So such as, social justice issue or civil, voting rights, or, immigration, for example. So, do you have, any advice for those individuals? So Emeril, I know you had some background in regards to, immigration. So, what advice would you give to this person?
Right, so as Cynthia mentioned, my background is in immigrant health, intergenerational family dynamics, and so I worked with immigrant populations in the Bay Area as part of my research. And so I think it's a matter of tying your interests and research interests back to current policy issues that are a priority, perhaps in your community or state or at the federal level, and being able to see how those interests might relate to these more macro issues, because we know that society and social life is complex. These issues are not mutually exclusive domains. And so I think showing how your interests might connect to or help inform related or perhaps even unrelated policy issues is important to highlight.
Did you have anything
to add to that? I would just say that it's not, you could think about your skills not as topic specific, but also the generalities of bringing a critical lens and scientific thinking to a environment where that's not the prominent approach to things. And so if think if for any policy, bringing evidence in to inform that policy can come in a number of different formats, and so we as scientists have the ability to think critically about what that evidence is and how to build on that and make informed decisions. And so I think that it's very possible to shift from a specific discipline to a policy focus where the topics are not aligned with one another, and you're bringing your scientific engineering skills with you in that process. So really make sure to keep that in sight.
Well, thank you, ladies. We have 5 minutes left, and so I wanted you both to share some parting advice. So for someone who has started their application but has not submitted or is hesitant in submitting their application, what advice would you give? So I'll start this off with Julia and then turn it to Emeril.
Start early. That's the best that you can get a draft of your application together and have other people look at it. I mean, that's really the number one thing that I would suggest, of making sure that you have other people's eyes on it and get feedback from people who you trust and who you think understand what AAAS might be looking for, whether that's because they have experience with the fellowship themselves or because they are aware, they know about science policy. And so start early, get people to give you feedback. And yeah, it's been such a unique experience, and has helped. I would just reiterate something that has been a theme throughout, about that all of these experiences of being in a totally different environment and learning the clarity of what science policy is really evolves over time, and so I would really encourage, it can be very much adapted to your own interests and what you're looking for. So I would very much encourage people to apply and start early.
Emeril?
I would suggest that think about, as you're putting together and finalizing your materials, that this is, doing that hard work of thinking about what your interests are and where you want to see your career going, but that this is a practical exercise, and the work that you're putting in now will feed into potentially future applications that you're writing, not just to AAAS, but any other type of fellowship opportunity or job that you might apply to. So it is not wasted effort, even if you don't get the fellowship. And I hope that for many of you, your life and professional circumstances might allow you to apply again in the future if you are not fortunate to place on this round of applying. But to know that the work that you're putting in is never lost, right? The act of thinking about and putting your thoughts to paper for this particular application will be beneficial for all the additional efforts that you put in for any other type of fellowship activity. So I hope that helps with as you're grinding through the final process.
Yeah. Well, thank you, ladies, both. And remember that you can apply to the fellowship at any point in your career. So even if you apply now, and then, in the event that it's not fruitful in terms of getting into the fellowship for 1920, then you can definitely apply in the future. But ladies, again, thank you so much for serving as a panelist today and allowing and answering questions that the panelists has had. And so if we could not get to your questions today, our October live chat will be updated on Friday. So we will definitely go back in and answer all of those questions that we weren't able to get to today. Please remember the application deadline is November 1st, 11:59 p.m. So please turn in or submit your applications. Visit the fellowship's website to view past chats in the series. and visit the website for more information and details related to the application process. So once again, ladies, thank you. Thank you so much for participating, and you all have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, Cynthia.